Nicene Council never would have happened if everybody just sort of, if there weren't heresies that were rising. Like, assuming that that nobody dissented from the Orthodox teaching, you wouldn't have ever gotten a Nicene Council. You'd have never gotten a Nicene Creed, or even the councils that followed it, or even.
Well, yes and no, because while they did largely deal with heresies, later councils at least also dealt with church structure. So it was, as the church grew, as it grew out of Jerusalem and gradually spread, one thing that began to become necessary is we've got to have a way to organize and structure as we get, one, farther and farther away from its birthplace and farther and farther away in time from its origins. So you begin to get over time this growth from bishops to metropolitans and patriarchs, and then what are called the patriarchates, that is the major organizational areas, dioceses, archdioceses, etc., all the way down to today, where you still have quote-unquote patriarchates, okay? But you also have some of the language of that early church still governing today, even where, as I had a conversation with a priest last year, was talking about, even where it's no longer appropriate. It's no longer fitting, for example. As an example, the individual called the ecumenical patriarch, that is the patriarch of the ecumenical church in Constantinople. And what is meant by ecumenical is he is the one, in one sense, over all the Orthodox churches. Okay, the ecumenical patriarchate claims authority / jurisdiction over all the Orthodox churches, for example, in the United States or in the Western Hemisphere. And he does this because when Constantinople was given essentially authority by one of the councils, I think the Fourth Ecumenical Council, obviously there weren't any churches in the Western Hemisphere. Okay, so everything according to the early language of the councils, everything in the Western Hemisphere is what is called part of the diaspora, even though it's not. We're here in the United States. Whether you're Orthodox or not, you're not in the diaspora. Why? Because I bet everybody in this room is native born. And probably, more than likely, just by looking around at your faces, your parents are native born. And more than likely, their parents were native born. And that may go back several generations. Okay? You're not spread out from the homeland. So this idea of diaspora means the Greeks, essentially, or the Middle Easterners, who went from one land to another and then set up their own way of worshiping within the confines of the church and such. So this notion that the ecumenical patriarch today works under is this idea that, oh, well, any orthodoxy that is in the United States had its origins in Greece, in Constantinople, etc., which in and of itself isn't true. The origins of orthodoxy in the United States come from Russia, not from the other. Okay? So this in and of itself kind of presents a problem. But this is one of the ideas, one of the issues that was dealt with in those early councils. So they weren't all necessarily focusing on heresies. They focused on quite a few other things as well. I mean, I don't want to say much of which is inconsequential, but much of which is really has no modern bearing. Do you smell that too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Something's burning, so
It might be the building.
We'll probably get an alarm in a few minutes. Okay, so what else? Robert said, the book seems to have been born out of response to heresy. What else? Book 3, obviously, is all about Christology, all about the nature of Christ and such. Okay, were there any here that just kind of blew you away, or things you hadn't heard before, or thought before, or read before?
This is going to seem really small and maybe obvious. I don't know, but for me, it just kind of stuck in my mind is that the idea of Mary conceiving was by choice, because he points out that it was once she accepted. So there's the idea she could have been like, well, that sounds great, but no. But there's something about that idea that just kind of stuck with me, that was willful. She wasn't forced. It wasn't the angel saying, here's what you're going to do, but there was permission. It had to have permission. There had to be a choice. I don't know, I can't really explain why, but I just had never really thought of it that way.
It's interesting, this book in particular, and I noticed, obviously, like, growing up, obviously, in places, not only, affected by the entire Western notion of, original sin and things like that, and sovereignty of God, but also growing up in, the South, where sort of Calvinism, for the longest time, reigned supreme, is that this is, in pretty much all of the works so far, you see a very distinct emphasis upon free will that you won't find in the Western Church. And this book in particular is very strong on the issue of free will. It takes a lot of time. He takes a lot of time just explaining how important free will is. I think that was in the first book, right?
To some extent, it's also in here.
Yeah.
Why? Well, let me rephrase that. Why does he do it? And why is that notion, why is it important? And you can even take it outside of a religious context. Okay? Think of what he says here about free will. Why is this an issue that should be discussed? Let's say in university classrooms.
Going back to, I think it was, Saint Basil's stuff. I think I'm getting them all mixed up now. Saint Basil's.
You just say the fathers.
I don't even have it with me anymore. The first one we read, not the one on wealth and poverty, but when he goes into how free will and intelligence are the things which, literally distinguish us from the animals, which is such an incredibly overused phrase. It's like this is what distinguishes us from the animals, but really like free, because he goes into like animals are creatures of instinct. Human beings are the only creatures with the capacity to go beyond instinct to the point of like actually being able to reason and make choices that are against our base nature, and so obviously there's this idea that free will is an element, if not the most important element, to our containing the image of God. And so you can definitely see how that there's this feeling that you can't lose that, and also when as Robert was saying in response, and how a lot of these sort of things were a response to outside criticisms and things, you can definitely see how St. John of Damascus, and you can see that in book 2, is his responding to this idea of astrology and fatalism. This idea that we are ultimately just puppets, and he's very strongly pushing against that notion.
Well, and not only that, your comment about responding to criticism from outside, more often than not, it's not from outside. It's from within the fold, and that's what makes some of the ideas heretical. But think about that notion of free will, and apply it to, well, not only but works of literature of the 20th century, specifically dystopian literature. Well, what is one of the dangers? Orwell is writing about in 1984? What's one of the dangers Bradbury's writing about in Fahrenheit 451? What's one of the danger? What is almost the danger Huxley's writing about in Brave New World?
Us giving up our free will to other people.
Giving it up?
Or
letting it be taken away? I mean, okay, leave the literature aside for a moment. I know Robert wants to say something. Take 2013 America. What has been happening since September 11th, 2001? Control. Fear.
Limitations. Okay. It's constantly limiting, trying, because it'll never work. It's insane. But trying to limitate potential.
Okay.
It's reducing everything to the most simple equations.
To try to make it seem like it's for our own good.
It's making sure everything will be reduced to A plus B equals C. Well, so we can predict it, we can control it, we can confine it, and there'll be no chance. There'll be nothing to move beyond other than, nothing will be unexpected, no surprises. That's what we're trying to prevent, is a world of interest or surprise.
It's trying to convince people that taking their free will is good because there are some people who will abuse it and destroy the other people, but in reality, free will is just, it's something given to all of us. It doesn't need to be taken away from anybody.
It's that notion of giving up freedom for security that ends up falling apart.
Ben Franklin.
Yeah.
That's the quote I was thinking of, and that's what I looked up. Any society, Ben Franklin said, he that would give up, any society that would give up a little liberty to gain a little security will deserve neither and lose both.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So think of what that means in the context of what has happened in our society since 2001. What have we given up and what have we gained in return?
Certainly not greater security.
Okay, why not?
Because it's
nothing's changed.
Well, except if you're going to make that argument, then you have to look at the things that have been prevented or the things that never happened, and which you can't speculate about.
And the things that never happened that we don't know about.
Right. And what about the things that we do know about, though?
And even the things that we do know about. Okay? But, for example, the underwear bomber guy, okay? A couple of years ago at Christmas time. Or the shoe bomber, Richard Reed. 2002, tried to detonate his shoes on an American Airlines flight from London to the United States. That's why we have to take that one incident is why everybody under the age of 75 and over the age, I think it is, of like 5, has to take off their shoes before they get on a plane. What's the assumption?
Everyone has bombs in their shoes.
Yeah.
The assumption is everyone could have bombs in their shoes.
Okay. Well, think of the underwear bomber.
If the assumption was everyone had bombs in their shoes, we'd all be riding here.
Okay. Think of the underwear bomber. If you take that analogy, that would mean everyone gets their underwear inspected.
Well, they have those X-ray
What do you
machines
do?
where they do that.
Okay, you go up there. What does it do? It scans you. So that somebody off in a room somewhere is essentially seeing you naked. Okay? How much freedom have we given up? For what return?
There's no privacy for the illusion of freedom for the wolves that may or may not be outside the fence. I mean, this idea that this may happen, well, I hate to tell you, but yeah, anything's possible. You can't live your life under this idea. It's like, what if this happens? Yeah, what if it does, man? Grow up. It's like,
okay,
what if my heart stops right now or this building goes up in flames? How has this ever been different than it has ever been?
Joe Biden said yesterday, in fact, at a funeral, a IT cop who was killed by the bombers, said something to the effect of, they didn't win, they didn't do what they wanted to do, we won't be intimidated. Okay. Now, I'm assuming none of you were in Boston from the date of the marathon until Friday evening when the two guys were caught. But even if you weren't, if you read or heard anything about it, what was going on in Boston from like Thursday afternoon until Friday down?
Martial law is what is the word that needs to be used. It's martial
Well,
law.
except it wasn't martial law because you didn't the military on the streets telling people you're going to be arrested, blah, blah, blah. But what did happen? People were told, stay inside. Businesses stayed closed. Public transportation was shut down. Who won? Did we win simply because the one guy actually ran over his brother and killed him? Okay. Did we win because the other brother got arrested? Or did terrorism win? I mean, what did it do? It shut down a city of over 1 million people for over 24 hours. Okay, now, say you're some rinky-dink, wannabe terrorist. What does that teach you? Man, I could bring Philadelphia to its knees. I could bring D.C. to a standstill. I can stop Miami. I can stop L.A.
And I don't even have to do anything really big to do it.
Well, that on top of the fact that they're like limiting our like you have to register your ammo now. Like I saw something on Facebook and it was just like I bet the people in
If
Boston
you can
wish
find
they
any,
were locked up in their house with some AR-15s with unlimited.
if you can find any to buy.
Well, the concept
Yeah,
of
that one.
the concept of our free will, like us protecting ourselves, is gone because we're so dependent upon the government to protect us from everybody else that we can't even protect.
Senator Dianne Feinstein said, even with what happened in Boston, you don't need an AR-15. A simple shotgun will do the job.
Yeah.
Okay, have any of you watched the clip of the shootout? I really encourage you to do it. Not because you see blood and everything. You don't. It's nighttime. It's some damn fool with their cell phone in their window, and the guy comes to find out one of the bullets hit his wall, went through his roommate's desk chair. Okay? Well, why? Because they fired off rounds. Boom. Okay, there's two. Meanwhile, they're boom, 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 boom. That's semi-automatic. You have to pull the trigger for each, burst. So what's given up? Why the importance of free will?
Well, outside of any kind of political, social things, if you have free will, then there's always the chance of aspiring. You can aspire. If you have free will, you can say, well, nothing's fixed. It's not this immutability where it's like, I'm just bad.
Just a cog in the machine.
Yeah, it's horrible, or it's hopeless, or it's bad, or nothing can ever be better. And I think, if you have a society that feels that way, that's ultimately the society that you'll live in.
And yet, what kind of conversation do we hear going on among our political leaders, quote unquote, about the Tsarnaev brothers? We hear the language used of what radicalized them.
Yeah.
What exactly made them become what they became. The idea is that they had no free will. Older brother said, the hell with the United States, I'm going to create some mayhem. Okay? We see that whenever something really bad happens, what makes so-and-so do that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Well, John of Damascus is talking about that. It's a simple choice.
Yeah. It's in a sense, when you're talking about the sin and atonement, ultimately what it boils down to is you don't have an excuse. You can't say, my nature made me do it, or the devil made me do it, or anything like that, because no one makes you do anything. If you do something that's wrong, it's your fault, and it's up to you to to set it right. Or
So what does he then say about, since we're talking about free will, what does he then say about the two wills? Will. And what, in our popular way of thinking, we kind of think, well, human, divine, whatever divine says goes.
Yeah. Well, that's.
So how does he deal with that?
I think if I understand, because I don't have a perfect understanding of everything he's saying, it's a dialogue. There's a dialogue of sorts. Judgment. You have to judge. And
Okay.
responsibility. You have to, you have to listen and judge and kind of reason through.
But what does he say about those two wills in Christ? How do they work? A word he never uses. It just amazes me, or the translator at least never uses, is they work in complete synergy, which is a word that is bandied around about in our society, and college, university administrators love it. They don't have a clue what it means. Okay? What does it mean? Well, it means you have God's will up here, and you have human will down here.
they're cooperating.
Cooperating. They're working perfectly in tandem. Now, in the person of Christ, they're cooperating. Okay? But let's take not the person of Christ. Instead, let's take Nita. Okay? What? That means that Nita's will goes on along. She goes about her daily business, blah, 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 blah. And God's will goes along on about his daily business, blah, 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 blah. And if Nita is in touch, in tune, in sync with God, what happens? These two things, like the rails on a railway, if you're standing in the middle and you look down far enough, what happens? They seem to touch. Okay? Simply because of this. If one is in tune, then what one does works in tandem, like hand in glove, like two sides of a coin. You can't have the one without the other, kind of a mentality. So, what does he give as examples of that? Look at everything he says about all the different miracles and etc. Christ does. He heals a blind guy. How does he heal a blind guy? Well, sometimes he merely speaks. Other times, spits on the ground, takes up the mud, puts it on his eyes. And what's going on there? Okay, you have the divine aspect and the human aspect. The hands touching, okay, people touching him, etc. That's the human. Blind, because obviously, if Robert suddenly went blind, and I said, "See," Robert would go, "It's a cruel joke, you dirty, rotten SOB."
Well, it's worth a shot.
It's worth it,
I appreciate
It's not my fault, it's your bad faith, If only you had faith. Okay? That's what he does. Okay, what else?
If you go blind, we'll all command you to see. Don't worry, Robert. It'll be completely ineffectual, but we will do it just for you.
Empirical skepticism says give it a shot.
If you don't give it a shot.
You never know. You never know.
Okay?
And if you give it a shot knowing it will fail, it's probably going to fail.
So, go back to something Robert said earlier about, the response of Mary. Why is that significant? You never really thought about it before. Why is it significant?
Well, she's no longer a cog in a massive dynamic plan. She's not just
To use
she's not
feminist
being used.
exactly. To use feminist language, she's no longer passive.
Yeah.
She's no longer merely being used by the male patriarchal. She becomes what? Think this.
Yeah.
Equal participant.
participating, Yeah.
Exactly. Equal participant. Because if she'd said, no, I don't really think so. I don't really like that idea of the Holy Ghost overshadowing me. It's kind of scary. Well, then what happens?
Presumably God would go and find someone else.
Yeah. Well, not this, you know.
Yeah.
Okay. So the significance of that becomes that she becomes the quote unquote first Christian.
Actually, that,
Except
by accepting Christ into
Yeah.
her heart.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
By accepting the Son, the co-eternal Word, you know,
Is-
the
is-
whole,
accepting the concept
and
of
showing the
free
free will. Because what does that do? Therefore, that's why, you know, the church will refer to her as the new Eve.
So, all right. So interesting. Like this is sort of sparks this question that I've been sort of trying to work through. Is this idea like I said, like, you know, had Mary said no, let's just say, you know, presumably God would have gone and found somebody else, but he didn't. Mary was the first person he proposed.
I hope she says yes.
Right. See, that's where I'm. Hold on. I'm leading somewhere. I'm not just, you know, throwing this out there. My question is, like, you know, there's kind of this there's this, I don't want to say controversy, but there's this issue of like middle knowledge. You know, God can determine what a person would choose in a given situation, or like he has that kind of, like, part of his omniscience is to know what, like, to sort of set up hypothetical circumstances and know what people would choose in that sense. So now I'm sort of struggling with whether that works with free will.
What does he say in the book about free will and about foreknowledge and predestination?
Foreknowledge is not the same thing as predestination.
Right.
It's
Bingo.
knowing what's going to happen, but not having any
Bingo.
hand in what happens.
I think the important thing, from just any kind of, you know, theological, philosophical standpoint, is the whole idea of God knowing anything is not like you knowing that there's, you know, bologna in the fridge. There's no comparison. There's no comparison to an omnipotent supra consciousness in anything, you know. So when you get into the territory of what does God know, it's like, well, it's
I
so
like to
beyond
think
you.
of it like how C.S. Lewis was talking
Don't
about it
limit.
when he had the
From
Silmarillion, because everything's pretty much already happened. So he could see like everything at the same time.
Right.
It's
No.
beyond
There's,
anything you can
see,
ever
that's the thing, though.
experience.
The middle knowledge presents, I think, a slightly different, like a slightly more knotty issue, because then you're dealing with like hypothetical circumstances. It's not just God knows what will happen; it's God knows what would happen if ... You know.
Yeah. There can be no middle when it comes to conversations about God. Because what does middle imply?
There's something higher.
Something higher, or there's something around it.
Yeah.
Okay? Circumscribed is uncircumscribed in what ways? All ways. That's why, you know, he mentions in here, he talks about, he talks not only about God's ineffability, but he talks a lot about God's being uncircumscribed, and talks about his unlimited power, unlimited knowledge, all those kinds of things. So that when we talk about, you know, to use language that C.S. Lewis will use in Voyage of the Dawn Treader. I think it's Voyage of the Dawn Treader. The what might have beens.
No, that's Prince Caspian.
Is it Prince Caspian? We think of the what might have beens. No, it is Voyage of the Dawn Treader. It's when they go off to the islands.
Then it's also Prince Caspian. He's talking to Lucy.
We think of the what might have beens. Okay? Why? Because our experience of time is like Robert Frost's person who's walking in the wood. Our experience of time is like this. When we have to make a decision, what do we do at this point?
Mm-hmm.
Because if we choose this point, what happens to this point? It's gone. Okay? Doesn't mean that we might not come back to it later, but it generally does, which is why in Robert Frost's poem, you know, the person goes away, and then what happens? Way leads on to way, and then it veers off like this, and then it veers off like So that by the time you get to the end of the journey, where he says, not knowing where this went, I shall be ages and ages hence. Okay, that I did not take the other way.
Wait, this is the road not taken, right? Yeah. Isn't this the one that Robert Frost said that do you have any sort of deep philosophical thing to say? And that,
Yeah,
that's probably what he ended up
He
saying.
might have said that. Doesn't mean it doesn't.
And not knowing what he said it.
Writers write from their subconscious as well as their conscious.
Right.
Okay. So, let's take this point and let's say it's a major point. It's not like choosing a college major, because most college students change their majors 3 or 4 times from when they first declare to when they finally end up. But let's say something major, like you're standing there or somebody's standing there with a weapon pointed at your head. What happens when they pull the trigger? It's not Looney Tunes. It's not the Matrix where you can make that bullet just stop in midair and go up and look around, and you pull the trigger, the bullet fires. Events have gone into what happens. This is gone. It's always and forever gone. That other option, and you can think of that other option, if you want, as being another universe.
Right.
Because
a possible world. Yeah.
Think of Doctor Who, for those who watch Doctor Who. What happens? Well, this stream of time, boom, it's gone. Which is why anybody who tries to write time travel fiction always runs into a conundrum, because it cannot be done logically. You can't figure out how it would work. Okay? So the idea of middle knowledge, when applied to God, that's like God saying, let's see, if I were to do this, would this happen? Or if I were to do this, this would happen. That's the idea of, I used the other day on the board, this is God's foreknowledge. What does it mean? He sees all. Mm-hmm. He sees everything that will happen, as well as everything that could happen. Right. He knows all possibilities.
Right. And then, but in between there is the would happen. Like there's could, and then there's will, and then there's...
No. If he sees let's say this is the will, and this is the could.
Right.
There is no in between those. If it's not this, then everything else is this. Okay? But just because, according to John of Damascus and others, just because he sees this doesn't mean, contra Calvin, doesn't mean he predestines all this. Doesn't mean that because he sees this is what's going to happen, he says, like Yul Brynner in the Ten Commandments, let it be written, let it be done, as it were. And therefore, this is now the only, because what's involved in here. Okay? And this is where he gets into, in that previous book, he talks about what is permitted, okay? And what naturally happens. Well, what's permitted are some of the bad things. People blowing up, pressure cooker bombs in wherever. People blowing up airplanes. People doing all kinds of horrible stuff, as well as people being born with cancer, etc. Okay.
So then that's the question. So does God know like contingent truths, like things that are contingent upon other?
What does God not know? I mean, you flip that over, and what you're saying is, what does God not know?
Well, see, that's the thing, though. Like, when you're talking about, like, that's where this issue is so naughty for me, is because when you talk about...
It's supposed to be.
Free will...
Jason?
Realize naughty, right?
K-N-O-T-T.
Gotcha.
A little confused.
Dirty knowledge.
trying to say something. It was
Profundity was on his lips, and then we were, taken from the sublime to the
I need to find a better word.
ridiculous.
No, it's because when you think of human freedom, it's when you think of human freedom, it's not determined by its circumstances, right? So then, if I'm having a hard time explaining this, and Wick does such a better job of explaining.
Well, it's like, do you know what you're going to do in the next 10 minutes? Do you know what you're going to say in the next 10 minutes? None of us do.
Right.
Okay? But in the divine economy, that is the management of things, does God know what each one of us is going to say or do in the next 10 minutes? Yes.
So,
are we therefore destined to do that?
all right. I'm going to use an example here.
The answer is no.
God. No. Yes.
According to the fathers.
But okay, so I guess to use an example, did God choose Mary to be the vessel to bring forth the Christ, knowing basically that if he did choose her, that she would consent? You see, this idea that does free will work in a context where where God can see contingent possibilities like that, where he can set up circumstances in which he knows the outcome of a free choice, and then bring those circumstances about so that he can bring about that free choice.
Elizabeth?
I was gonna say, well, what does it matter if he knows what the answer will be, so long as he's not looking here and going, you will say this, irregardless of what you feel, your answer will be yes.
Gabriel
He still has the choice to say no, even if the situation sets up to say the most likely outcome of her saying yes, or God knows that she's going to say yes. It hasn't taken away her free will just because God knows what her answer will be. He has not come down.
Well, not just will, but would. That's the thing.
Well, would. Irregardless, it's not like he has appeared in her head and is making her say those words.
Right.
So she still has that choice.
Robert?
All of that, so I think, if nothing else, you can at least apply, pragmatism. The idea, whether or not freedom of choice or will exists, I don't know. But the idea certainly does. It's a psychological truth because we're talking about it. And pragmatically, I feel that it's more beneficial to give yourself choice than to approach life fatalistically. So pragmatically, if you go by James, there's more truth in seeing yourself as being capable of choice than a fatalistic. You just become.
In other words, if it makes you feel better.
Well, if it works, I mean, it's not about feeling better, but if it works, and because that's the proof of the pudding is in its effectiveness. And personally, I think that giving yourself the flexibility of choice and some kind of autonomy it's more healthy.
Look at
you open yourself up to greater creativity and variety. If you say, well, it's fated, you might as well just sit in your own mess.
What could Mary have said? Oh, well, I don't really have any choice in the matter anyway, so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, you're going to anyway.
Yeah, use me. But that's not what happens. You look at the other example that John of Damascus posits towards the end of this book, which is Christ in the garden. Okay, what does he do? We see the human will really brought forth. He does not want to die. And he doesn't want to die specifically how? Crucifixion. In fact, he doesn't want to die so badly. What does he do? He sweats blood. I mean, you really have to not want to do something in order to have your sweat glands produce blood. And that's not, that passage in the New Testament isn't given to be a miraculous thing. Okay? So, he then does what? Let this cup pass from me, but not as I will, but as thou willest. Now, he goes into great detail and says, what's going on there? Because he is fully God at the same time that he's praying that. Who's he praying to? Himself? No, it's the human will making it known to the divine will, I don't want to do this. But then the human will subserves itself beneath the divine will. No, I don't. Okay? Get back to Mary for a moment. If you read the thing I had in the syllabus, but we never actually discussed it, and I think I said you didn't have to read it. If you read the Proto-Evangelion of St. James, okay, what is that largely about?
Mary.
Anybody read it?
Yeah, just
Mary.
her birth and growing up.
Her birth and growing up. Is she like every ordinary little girl,
No.
goes to prom, No. Okay.
See, now I'm imagining first century Jewish prom. So,
Which is scary. Okay. No, she is raised differently. It's as if being prepared for a different kind of life, being prepared, go back to the Old Testament. There are various images throughout the Old Testament that are used, by the church to say, these are types of Mary. Okay? To say Mary was being prepared from the beginning. Does it mean she was turned into a robot? Not according to this. Because what John of Damascus says is, if you don't have will, as he already said earlier, you can't have vice and you can't have virtue.
Right.
In which case, it's all a sham and Richard Dawkins is correct. And you may as well just, read Richard Dawkins for the rest of your life.
Just,
Oh, no, you wouldn't want to do
might as well
that.
just have-
Or hedonism.
Yeah, utilitarian hedonism. Just, hey, if it feels good,
Or be a bomber, because it doesn't really matter.
or a glutton or whatever. So
Glutton would probably be,
hard choices. There's no reason to make hard
I mean,
choices.
being
or
a
be
bomber, that cuts
responsible.
your,
Exactly.
that cuts your life pretty short.
Exactly. I mean, so you're essentially left. If this is wrong, you're essentially left with nihilism.
Yeah.
There is no point. Okay? With this, there is a point. Which is why Nietzsche said, if God is dead, everything is permissible. It's not an accident that, Hitler picked up on that. And for him, everything became permissible. Okay? For what reason? To achieve whatever the goals one has. Okay? Anything else?
I'm still trying to work through this mental knowledge thing.
No.
Have been for
Well,
have been for years, so
well,
it's not going to be resolved here.
Bear in mind one other thing he says. Some things are incomprehensible.
The unknown.
Stop.
This is something that's sort of at the center of a lot of the Protestant Catholic debates too. Because you got Molinism, which is was originally a Catholic theology, to combat. It was a Counter-Reformation.
Molinism?
Named after Molina. I think it was Alfred. No, that's
You're thinking of Doc Ock.
I'm thinking of Doc Ock. It's something of Molina or something like that. I can't remember what his first name was, but that was hilarious. Anyway, no, but yeah, it was a Counter-Reformation theology where he took the idea of Calvinism, which is where you have the idea of God just changing a person's will. And he said, no, what God does when he is electing individuals, is not to change their will, but instead to put them in circumstances in which their will would bring about in which their free will would bring about their becoming one of the elect, in other words. So God would say, okay, if this person isn't, at these circumstances, they will choose to become a follower of Christ, and so he would place that person in those circumstances, and then through his free actions, he would eventually become a follower of Christ. And of course, the question arises that if God has that particular kind of foreknowledge, whether the person is really free to choose.
Then what would even the point be of us being here if he just pretty much made us how he wanted us? Or, well, I mean, not that we aren't the way he wants us, but I mean, if we don't have free will, or he puts us in certain situations and stuff like that, what's even, there is no point to life.
Right, that's the
Yeah,
question.
what's the point of being put in this class?
I mean, that's also assuming that everyone along the line is going to do exactly what God wants them to do with their free will to get that person in the circumstances.
Right.
20 years later.
Obviously, God would have to be very intelligent to work this out, but I don't think
that's a
that's
lot
really.
of-
Understatement of the semester?
I mean, it's hard for me to say because I kind of have mixed feelings about any kind of teleology. I'm kind of on the fence about it. But,
Explain what you mean by that for those who
that there
aren't
is a
philosophically
goal.
inclined.
There is a goal. My guy Jung calls it individuation. Kierkegaard talks about it, to become oneself truly. But it can be denied. It can be denied infinitely throughout your life. And so you get opportunities. The opportunities are always there. You get little messages, or you make certain mistakes to put yourself in these positions, but you can always choose to ignore it. You can ignore things infinitely until you die. It's not set in stone that you're going to
It's true.
individualize.
It's true.
It must be chosen.
It's true. You can't ignore it, but what will your life be like if you ignore
Oh,
it?
it'll be.
According to Jung, each one of us has a resident genius.
Yeah.
Or, as one of his followers described, a demon,
Mhm.
okay, which is a guiding.
Yeah.
It's not a guiding spirit. I'm not talking about like guardian angels or anything. It's like there is a thing within you that determines what you ought to be and do.
Yeah.
We would say, it's like a stem cell for an acorn that determines the acorn will grow up to become an oak. An acorn will never grow up to become a walnut tree. It's impossible. Okay? And the point is that each of us have that same kind of thing. In other words, Caitlin is supposed to be something. She may not know what it is.
I agree.
Jordan is she may not know what it is. And we often spend our lives trying to find out what that is.
Yeah.
Some people find out early. And they just latch onto it. Einstein was not supposed to be a clerk in a patent office, obviously. Okay? Other people kick and fight and scream against it all their life, thinking instead that they want wealth, they want happiness, they want X, Y, or Z. Okay? And they die unhappy, unfulfilled, which is why Thoreau said, I wanted to go to the woods to do what? To live. So that when he died, he would know he sucked the marrow out of life. Okay?
And I think the important thing to recognize is Jung would say, it's the self. The self is the emergent. It's a sacrifice of the ego on the altar of the self. So the Garden of Gethsemane is a good example, because what is it? It's the assertion of the ego. It says, well, I want to be, I want to be Keith Richards. Well, that's fine, but the more you strive to do that,
Okay.
hey, he's pretty amazing. But you're denying what you really are, whatever that might be. It might be a really amazing, I don't know, whatever, just fruit canner. I don't know. But as long as you assert what you want, this kind of selfish ego cream, you're not being what you are. It's.
Which is why.
Which requires faith. I mean, it's Kierkegaard's thing, is not resigning yourself, not the night of infinite resignation, but of faith, to leap based on nothing, to kind of just trust.
To trust.
Okay. And it's
to trust in whatever the call is, which is, takes us back to the Garden of Gethsemane, as well as to the earlier garden. What was Christ born for? The cross. Okay. What was Adam made for? Glory. And what did he do?
subverted.
He exchanged real glory for a false glory. He exchanged real knowledge of good and evil for a false knowledge of good and evil. He exchanged, nakedness and glory for clothing in unglory, inglory, disglory, however you want to put it, lack of glory, okay? Putrescence, let's say, all right? I mean, just all those kinds of things. Look at Mary. Mary, by saying yes rather than no, fulfilled her purpose, let's say, okay? Think of Paul. Well, you've got the two sides of Paul. You've got Saul, who's sitting there doing what? Persecuting Christians. And then Saul, he changes, and he's no longer persecuting. He's now leading, directing, guiding, teaching, and dies as a result. Why? Because the first, he was an acorn trying to be a cherry.
False.
He wasn't fulfilling whatever that inner call, inner genius was for him. Okay? What else? All right, I don't want to. Pardon?
Just a random fact that I remembered. Molina, who came up with that theology, was a Jesuit.
Was a Jesuit, okay.
Uh-huh.
I mean, he like the second book, he goes into a lot of stuff that, we probably wouldn't really think a whole lot about. The operations, the different kinds of thought, the different kinds of fear.
But what's interesting about that, and it's funny because Robert and I, on Tuesday, we were talking about how how in book 2 it sort of feels like we've completely gotten off track at this point. But what's interesting is you can see that if you really think about it, there is definitely a reason why he's including all this supposedly irrelevant things into the exact exposition of the Orthodox faith. And from a thematic standpoint, it's a literature class. From a thematic standpoint, it's this idea that that Christianity, that God and all these things that are contained within the Orthodox faith touch every aspect of our lives.
Yeah, everything is connected.
They touch psychology. They touch nature. They touch astronomy. Everything. Everything is informed by the faith.
By understanding. By understanding how it all connects.
Right.
Exactly.
It's all interconnected.
There are no accidents. Yeah. And it even goes in and he talks about when he talks about human nature. Remember what he says about the difference between substance and accident? Because this is language you'll see in the Western medieval church. Okay? And it's specifically brought up, for example, in the Western medieval church with the Eucharist and the doctrine of transubstantiation. Okay? Which the Eastern Church has no doctrine of at all.
Transubstantiation.
No, that's another word. Well, what's substance? Substance is the essence of something. Okay? It's isness.
Yeah.
What's the substance of this? Wood pulp.
Yeah, wood pulp.
Okay? Wood pulp. Its accidents is paper. Accidents is how it appears. Okay? The substance of this is cotton. The substance of this, by which I mean the plastic, not that. Petroleum. We could go even farther back. What do they say petroleum is the result of?
It's compressed vegetation.
Okay. Compressed vegetation.
Dead dinosaurs.
Dead dinosaurs. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know anything about petroleum.
Are they still saying that?
I don't know.
I remember when I was in school, it used to be taught that petroleum was the remains of decomposed dinosaurs that had compressed under the earth, Think
That sounds
about
really an odd way to come up with
it's
like,
asinine.
Yeah.
It can't be the truth. Think of where many of the oil fields are. I mean, some of them are not only down below the ocean, and I know that, tectonic movement, all that kind of stuff, but you have to go down 5,000 to 10,000 feet into the crust to get to some of these oil fields.
You've gone past when there were
That's
animals.
not Pangea and all this kind of. I mean,
in terms of like
there's something else. Something from outer. I don't know. Something else. So, whatever it is. Okay. So you have those two differences. So what happens then with this? Well, what is the substance in the Catholic doctrine, at least, of the host? Bread and wine. And then what happens? Well,
Flesh and blood.
they come up with this for a particular reason. We have to understand. The whole purpose of scholastic theology in the Middle Ages is an attempt to explain the inexplicable.
Yeah. And so they basically say that the accident remains the same. Still looks like, and tastes like, and feels like.
Still looks and tastes like
wine.
Welch's grape juice and, or wine and a little, if it's the modern church, a little wafer of cracker or something. But really,
substance
exactly.
is-
Now, one of my brothers and my dad, they're still practicing Catholics, and my brother swears up and down that which I'm not going to call him on it, but that there have been tissue studies of the transubstantiated host that shows that it is no longer bread, but it is flesh.
Human flesh.
So what?
So
I
that
mean,
doesn't
I
even-
hate to call them out on it because I love them and I don't disrespect. I have no disrespect for the Catholic Church, but what he's talking about is not faith. He's
It's
talking
not,
about fact.
it's not even platonic, idea.
No, it's
it's not even
Aristotelian, observational.
Yeah, it's trying to prove. Okay.
I believe this because it's a fact.
Yeah.
yeah. And
It's under a microscope.
he's missing the point, isn't
But
he?
it
Because
is an
the
extension
stuff you
of
see under the
Roman
microscope is supposed to be the accident, right? It's supposed to be the surface level. There's the idea of the substance is a very kind of it's a metaphysical concept.
It's kind of
not
it's kind of
Well, also
platonic
understand
because
it's in the Catholic.
how the argument would be how can we really understand the isness of anything?
Yeah.
That is what it really
Yeah.
ultimately
Our narrow
kind of
gestalt
is,
arrangement
yeah.
and all that. Big deal.
But he talks about these when he talks about human nature, because he says we are all one in here because we all share human nature. And by human nature, he talks about a body and a soul. But we are individual human beings. Okay. Well, where does Christ fit in? Because Christ he's the oddball. Because you have God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and you have humanity, and they don't mix. And then you have Christ, who is God and man. So he has human nature and he has divine nature, but it's not a mixture of human and divine nature. It's not a combination. It's not a composite, which is why he repeatedly, every time he brings it up, what does he say? He always says it's never mixed.
So then you don't have you don't have the same idea like in the Trinity where they're contained within each other. They're
In
not
terms,
circumscribed. They
in terms of
exist within each other.
in terms of his divine nature, yes, because the divine nature never leaves.
Right, no, but I mean in terms of the human nature and the divine nature within Christ, they don't mix in the same
No.
way. They're not contained within each other.
No.
Its own thing.
He says they're fully joined but never mixed,
Right.
which in and of itself is what? It's inexplicable. You cannot explain that by any shape, manner, form, even though tons of people have tried. Supposedly St. Patrick said, oh, look, it's pretty shamrock. It's an explanation for the Trinity. Because it's 3 nodes of one single leaf. Okay. C.S. Lewis came up with, the image of the cube.
Well,
The cube is multiple sides, but it's still one cube kind of a thing. Okay? But that doesn't attempt to explain it.
Well, with Lewis, he was using the cube of an example, something that 3 dimensions can produce, right? He was trying to tie.
Well, no, he uses it because he's doing it in the passage where he's talking about the Trinity. What do you have? You've got that, okay? You don't see necessarily those parts. So you see that part, you see that part. You don't see this part because it's on the back.
You don't see that
part. You don't see that part there, okay? So that's all you really see. So what do you see? One box, yet it's got 1, 2, 3 sides.
Right. Well, I'm remembering this passage because he talks about the analogy. If I remember, he uses because his analogy for the Trinity isn't aspects of the cube; it's aspects of space. It's
up,
depth,
down,
up, down. It's length, width,
breadth.
Yeah.
Breadth, depth, and width.
Sorry, that has very little to do with what we're talking about.
I kind of feel better because reading that it is hard to go. He's telling me what's not, but I'm not perfectly getting what he means. It's kind of reassuring again to go, okay, well, I'm not supposed to.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is why he says 2 or 3 times in here. One of them I've got, for example, page 331. And I love that he included this. In chapter 26, God's word at the top of the page first, and then the bottom. God's word himself then endured all things in his flesh, while his divine nature, which alone is impassible, remained unaffected. What does that mean?
He wasn't injured.
As a human, he was hungry. As a human, he had to use the restroom. As a human, he was thirsty. As a human, he was tired. That is in his human nature. Okay, what else? It means when he was scourged and beaten on his back, it hurt. He didn't go, ooh, do that again. That felt good. No. For when the one Christ made up of both divinity and humanity suffered, the passible part of him suffered. That is, his human nature. Because it was of its nature to suffer. It's of human flesh's nature to feel pain. But the impassible did not suffer with it. Thus, since the soul is passible, it does feel pain and suffer with the body when the body is hurt, although it itself is not hurt, which is why the soul can suffer when the body is hungry. The divinity, however, being impassible, does not suffer with the body. Now go down to the last few lines on that page. Examples do not have to be absolutely and unfailingly exact. For, because it's an example, one must find in it that which is unlike and that which is like. For likeness in everything would be identity, and not an example, which is especially true with divine things. So, in the matter of theology and the incarnation, it is impossible to find an absolutely perfect example.
Right.
And what's he getting at by there? How do we tend to reason? We reason through analogy.
Like when he does it himself. Like when he says that Christ or that the Son is like the light.
Exactly.
The Son is to the Father what the light is to the flame.
Exactly.
He's obviously not saying that that's a perfect analogy. No analogy is perfect because if it's a perfect analogy,
every analogy. Exactly. Every analogy breaks down. Right. Why? Because an analogy is not the thing itself.
Right.
Okay. And he makes that point kind of again and again and again, where he says, we kind of reach the certain level, and other fathers of the church, we're not reading of them, essentially say, you just have to shut up, where you reach a point of silence. And in fact, many of fathers say silence is the only perfect theology, where you just shut up and look, observe what it is to be observed. Okay? Why don't we stop there, and then we'll either do chapter 4 on Tuesday, or I'll just have you turn in your papers and turn you loose. We'll do one of those two things. I'll see what you want to do.